Oh, hi, Catherine. You're already here.
Good, how are you?
Get the recording started. Okay, looks like we're recording, and we're here now with the GOE's prep session with some folks who are preparing to take the general ordination exams in January of 2021. I'm Dr. Jason Fowd from Bexley Seabury Seminary, and we have some folks from Bexley Seabury, but also from across the church in various ways who are preparing for the exam. So that's who we are. That's what we're doing here tonight. Absolutely, yeah. Hey, and there will be people joining us, and everyone is welcome. This is Bexley Seabury is providing this, but that's different than saying it's exclusive to Bexley Seabury. We're just interested in helping folks who are going to be taking the GOEs to, feel confident as you go into doing that, because you should. They're meant to be answered. So that's great. Good. Some of you I know, some of you don't know. I think I'm going to go ahead and get started. I'll say this. If you have questions as we go, please don't be afraid to interrupt. Okay, just start speaking or whatever, and we'll get it together. Right? That's the value of doing this live. Otherwise, I'd just send you something to, a YouTube video or a piece of paper to read or something. Right? So we'll make it a conversation, but I'll especially to start, just kind of give you the overview. And again, I sent you the GOE's prep document. We'll be working our way through that tonight. So you all have it. There's only one mistake that I saw in it. Well, two actually, but I did say that the exam is set for January 4th, 5th, and 7th in 2019. That's wrong. The dates are correct, but the year is wrong. So those are actually the dates you all will be taking it, January 4th, 5th, and 7th. Anyway, there's one other little thing we'll get to it as we go on, but we'll just make a start for now. So honestly, as I started off saying, it's not rocket science, it's not brain surgery, it's the GOEs, and in fact, you have been studying for this for 2.5 years. And I took the GOEs way back when God was a child, and I mean, when they were over, 7 days, and where there were more exams, and we had to walk uphill both ways, and you were given a concussion before you started, so that everyone is starting out right there. No, I'm kidding. I did have a concussion, but that's a different story. I'll tell you later. But it was, back in 2001, I guess it was that I took it. Feels like forever ago now. But I mean, as I've reflected on that, as I've done my work, I used to work with the General Board of Examining Chaplains to assess the exams. So I've seen a lot of people's exam answers to questions. And I've, over the last 11 years now, I have been helping students to prepare. And so really, job one for you folks is not freaking out, okay? I mean, that seems like really basic, but, or maybe a little silly, but honestly, that's really it. Job one, manage your anxiety. Everything else is like details, right? I mean, just manage your anxiety. So part of that is don't cram, okay? You've been studying for this for 2.5 years, some of you a little bit longer, maybe some of you not as long, whatever, but you've been studying for this, all the classwork that you've been doing, all the reading you've been doing, all the preparation and formation you've been doing. This is not going to be new stuff. They're not going to have you come in and expect to do differential calculus. Well, I mean, I had a priest who did differential calculus once. You need to know this. Well, I mean, that's not what you've been studying for, okay? You're gonna be talking about scripture. You're gonna be talking about history. You're gonna be talking about theology, current events, and so forth. All the things you've been thinking about, reading about, studying for up to now. So don't cram. Don't feel like you need to go back and read a whole bunch of other stuff because you've been reading this stuff. In fact, what you might do is you might skim through or just kind of lightly review some of your notes or resources. Maybe you'll get out, here's where I should have a stack of books right next to me, but in theology, you might go back and get out your Alistair McGrath, Introduction to Christian Theology, or whatever introductory textbook you had, and just flip through it so that you're familiar. If you need to go and find something, it's right there. Or similarly, if you have a one-volume Bible commentary or New Testament, Old Testament commentary, or a really nice, history of the church, get those out. Just kind of flip through them a little bit. Be familiar with them. You don't need to reread them. You might skim through your notes just to refresh your memory. But you're not going back and redoing everything. You've been doing it, and it's up here. Okay, so the best way I found to prepare, actually, seriously, going back and reviewing previous general ordination exams. And the Board of Examining Chaplains is a good website, and I highly recommend you go, familiarize yourself with it, know how to get to it. If you have questions on the day, you need to look at something. It's just helpful to have there. But look through it before the day too. It gives you general expectations, a lot of which we'll be talking about tonight. The general expectations about the exam, what to expect, all that sort of thing. It's all there. This isn't meant to be a surprise. There's nothing on here that should be a surprise at all. And in fact, in 2016, when they started including rubrics for your answers, there was even less of a surprise. It's meant to be pretty straightforward. It's going to be a bit of work, right? That's not surprising, but there are no surprises. It wouldn't be a good exam if there were. It wouldn't be a good exam if they were talking in code language that no one who went to your seminary would possibly know, but everyone who went to seminary B would know. Again, that's a terrible exam, and this is not a terrible exam. Okay, so go back and review previous GOEs. What I did was I sat down and I actually timed myself writing out responses for a couple. And then after I kind of got the feeling for that, I stopped doing that. And I just went and looked at the previous questions, because it gives you a good idea of the kind of questions they're going to be asking in 2021 when you take the exam. And then maybe I'd take a few minutes and I'd outline what my answer would be to this question, just to get a sense. So, because here's the thing, I mean, partly you do it to become familiar with it, partly you do it to time it, partly you do it to encourage yourself. You can look and say, oh yeah, I could answer that question. That's not a too difficult of a question. So anyway, that was what I found most helpful, and that's what I recommend to my patients who chew gum, to go and look at previous the previous exams. They're all there for time immemorial, and spend some time with that. I found that really helpful because, again, it just gets you thinking in terms of the exam. So there, again, no surprises on the day. Now, most valuable for you in that regard will be looking at the exams over the past 5 years. Since, well, 4 years, really, since 2016. Other years will be useful too, but especially in the last 4 years, because they'll have, well, we'll talk about the format and everything in a few minutes. But yeah, back through 2016 especially will be helpful to you, because the format of those questions will look like the format of the questions you're going to be looking at. So manage your stress and anxiety beforehand. Again, that's job one. So the day before the exams start, January, the 3rd, I think it is, go out and see a movie or get together with some, sorry, with COVID, get together on Zoom with some friends maybe or something, right? Have a virtual drink together, whatever, right? But all I'm saying is, get together with your family. All I'm saying is manage your anxiety, okay? Try to do everything you can to go in just confident, relaxed. You've done your preparation. You've been working on this for 2.5, 3, 4 years, whatever. Don't stress yourself out. Like I said, it's 2021, not 2019. The exam's on the 4th, 5th, and 7th. So you have 2 exams on each of those 3 days for a total of 6 exams. But take the 6th, Feast of the Epiphany, a great day to take off from exams. Take that as a day off. Go for a walk, work out, pray, sing, go for a run, go for a bike ride, depending on your climate, whatever. Do whatever you need to do to relax and catch your breath. So again, just manage your time around the exam as well as within the exam. So there are 6 essay questions. Now here's the thing. Each essay question is intended to be answered in around 1,000 words. And that's important, not because they're going to be looking and saying, oh, I don't know, that's 1,010 words. This is not going to sustain. It's important because it gives you a clear sense of the scope of your answer. Some of these questions, you could write a set of books on. You could write a theological dissertation on. That's not what you're doing now, believe me. You're writing 1,000 words. At the same time, if you have a response to the question and you look down at the bottom in Microsoft Word and it says 402 words, you're going to stop and say, I missed a section, or I haven't given sufficient detail, because they're really looking for about 1,000 words in your response. So 1,000 words then is a clue for how to use your time and for the scope of your answer. Not a lot bigger than 1,000 words, but probably at least 1,000 words, not a lot less than 1,000 words. It would be difficult, they think, to do justice to it in much less than 1,000 words. If you do it in 950 words, no worries. Come back and tell me about it later. That's fine. So each of the questions is intended to be answered in 2 hours, but they give you 3.5. So again, it's not intended to be something that freaks you out, that pins you down to the mat and beats you up. It's intended to be something that can be answered in less time than they give you. So here's the thing too. The essays, the GOEs are open resource. All of the questions this year, again, are open resource. So that means if they ask you a question about something like, to take a random subject, Christian perspectives on money, or Christian perspectives on wealth, perhaps, you don't necessarily have to have committed to memory a half a dozen different Christian theologians and what they've said about wealth. You can say, I've got some good resources right here, and you've got some resources that you've collected and have next to your computer where you're composing your answer. You can spend some time then, not a lot of time, but a little bit of time looking in the index, chasing it down. Okay, what did this person say about it? Oh, I remembered someone, yeah, that's right, this guy said, so what really did he say? Let me find that quotation. So that also means you can have a prayer book, hymnal, Bible, reference work, whatever. It also means you can use CDs, you can use the internet. Right, so on the one hand, then, I would counsel you to, as part of your prep, as part of your non-anxious, non-freak-out preparation of building confidence and just getting ready, what you do is you go around and carefully think through what resources and books you already have. Okay, I've got McGrath, I've got, my commentary, I've maybe got one other theologian, I've got prayer book, I've got Bible, I've got my hymnals right here, I've got, a couple of really good history texts, whatever. I've got a nice ethics resource, and you just have them, have them next to wherever you're composing your answer. The thing is, use your time now to collect those and make sure you have them. And it's not too late if you decide, actually, I read I read McGrath, for example. Sorry, I'm a theologian, I keep going back to it. I read McGrath, but I want something else, another kind of reference work. It's not too late to order it from your favorite online bookseller. Jahan, did I see that you had a question? Okay, great. So that's anyone. Please feel free to just break in. I've kind of got a head of steam up. I thought I saw your hand, John. Okay. So what you're doing between now and then is going back through the resources you already have, through the books you've read for seminary or whatever study program you've been in, collecting them, having them, having them around so that they're ready to go for the exams. You can have those. Okay, so that's the one side of what I want to say about this, which is have that ready and just waiting for you for when you do the exams. Here's the other thing I want to say to you, though, too. You have 3.5 hours to write a 2-hour essay. It could be tempting, especially if you're feeling anxious, to get in and lose yourself doing a lot of original research for your essay. My gosh, I don't know much of anything about what Christians have said about wealth. You know, I can't believe Fout didn't cover it in his class, for Pete's sake. What's wrong? You know, so I need to go out and, okay, so I'll read this book and I'm going to skim this other resource, and I've got these 3 great websites. And the thing is, you look up and before you know it, 3 hours have passed. You haven't spent any time with the question, and the time's gotten away from you. So all I'm saying is, again, I guess the subtext is always just don't freak out, right? Manage your anxiety, but don't get lost in your books, looking through the resources, trying to find one more thing to say. Usually, no, I'm sorry, not usually. The questions are really clear what they're looking for, and they do not require you to do original research. They require you to find facts and information, which you are then asked to apply in one way or another to some sort of a concrete and often pastoral situation. That's it. So you don't need to go and read 3 books on Christian approaches to wealth. You need to, you know, have a sense of a couple of people who maybe have written about this. The relevance of my talking about Christian perspectives to wealth will be a little clearer here in a few minutes, I think. So, okay, so the responses are open resource. That's good news, that's bad news. It's good news, you can assemble your library, have it all there. That's great. You don't have to have it all up here because you can have it all here. But it's also a peril for you if you think that you need to go and spend a lot of time doing original research. That's not what it's about. Don't let the resources overwhelm you. And if you can respond to the question without having to spend much or any time in the books, all the better. So some general strategies for responding to the questions. Friends, I have graded more GOEs than I care to remember. I can't tell you how, well, I can tell you. I can't tell you how often the problem with the response is that they have not responded to the question or the entire question. And actually I can tell you because it's actually quite a lot. So the first thing you do when you open up your file, read the entire question. Be clear what it's asking. Again, this is a matter of managing your anxiety. Okay, don't sort of see the first couple of sentences and say, oh, okay, I know what this is about, and sit down and start writing. Read through the entire question. Be really clear what it's asking. It's important that you respond to the question that's being asked. That's maybe worth repeating. It's important that you respond to the question that's being asked. That's because you will be assessed, your proficiency will be assessed on how you respond to the question being asked. Hope that's an excellent question. I'll get to that in a few minutes. Please come back to me if I don't. So take a moment then, make sure you understand before beginning to think of a response. Make sure you understand what's being asked. And one way to understand a question, and this is really important, is to notice the parts of a question. Does it have only one part? Does it have 2 or 3? Does it suggest that one part should be larger than another? Or should they be about the same? The questions recently, especially since 2016, and this is one reason, again, why I was encouraging you to focus on the exam since 2016, they're really clear. Write a section of about 800 words on this, and then respond to this issue in 200 words. So clearly, with that question, you've got two sections, but they're not equal, right? It's not like 500 words, 500 words. It's telling you the first one needs to be about 4 times as long as the last one. So you need more detail in the first section and less detail in the 200-word section. Also notice what specific elements are expected in a response. It's not inside baseball to suggest that you need to make sure that you include all of them. Okay, so if it's asking for 3 different elements, you need to do an exegesis. You need to talk about a larger thematic issue in the canon. You need to come up with a contemporary application of it. If there are 3 elements expected in that response, you need to do all 3 of them. You just need to be aware of that. You also need to notice whether the question asks for a pastoral response to a particular person or a group, or maybe just a reasoned exploration of a topic. Maybe it's asking for your thinking on a matter, or maybe it's asking for you to give something like a script of what your response would be to this person. Of course, your response to the person also needs to be able to cover the bases of what they're asking about. So there are a couple of different ways the questions are asking you to respond. It's important that you notice how it's asking you to respond. Okay, so you've read the entire question. You haven't just dived in. You're relaxed and unanxious. You've noticed all the parts of the question and how they should be in balance with each other or not. You've noticed the specific elements in a response, and you've been very careful to notice that whether it needs a pastoral response or just a reasoned exploration of a topic. Now, having done that, take some time then to think through your answer. I strongly suggest, and people have different experiences with outlines and that sort of a thing, I strongly suggest, though, writing an outline of your response, because that, or whatever you do for that, don't just sit down and start writing. Make some notes. I like an outline because that's going to give you a plan of action before you immediately jump in. So make sure then that the structure of your outline and the response reflects the structure of the question. And in fact, the really smart money says make sure that the structure of your outline and response doesn't just reflect the structure of the question, but also the rubric, which will be used to evaluate the question. We'll talk more about that in a few minutes. So this is also helpful if you have an outline of your response. It also helps you to manage your time. Because if you just if you're like me and you just happen to jump in, you might get some really great thoughts about this first section, but before you know it, you're 1,500 words in and you've gotten to just your first point. Meanwhile, you're 500 words over the total limit, and you still needed to write 200 words about a second topic later on. To think through the entire response before you sit down and start writing is going to help you then to have an overview that will be a very helpful guide as you continue writing. So I mentioned rubrics already. What I want to say then is before beginning to write your response, read closely the rubric that they have provided for the question. It's going to tell you in some detail what is needed to provide a proficient response. Now, test takers, these were provided for the first time in 2016, as I mentioned. Test takers found them incredibly helpful because they describe exactly what a reader will be looking for. And then what I suggest is then, after you finish writing, go back and reread the question and the rubric to make sure that you've done everything expected. Ideally, by then, you're just so confident because you started out from a close reading of the question and from the rubric, you can just say, of course, I did all this stuff. But it always helps to check your work. Now, if in your response you use someone else's words, a quotation, a citation, something like that, you must cite them. The General Board of Examining Chaplains says that you must cite all sources consulted, whether or not they are directly quoted. And so if you're summarizing something that is not your own thought, you looked it up in Sam Wells or Jürgen Moltmann or Rosemary Radford Ruther, and is a brilliant idea, and you wanted to include it, but you found it with them, you'll need to cite them in your response. At the same time, though, I would counsel you, by and large, not to make use of many quotations, and especially don't make use of extensive quotations. This should be your response and not someone else's. They want to know how you can think about an issue. It's fine if you're making recourse to a well-known thinker on this topic, or a resource in history, for example, whatever. But the last thing you want to do, and I'm saying this having just graded a stack of papers as long as my arm, the last thing you want to do is to pepper your quotation with a lot of block quotes that you've copied out word for word from a text that you've been reading. Don't do that. They really want your response. I don't remember what the General Board of Examining Chaplains says about citation format. It might be that they simply don't care. I mean, if you had MLA beaten into you, well, you have my condolences, but use MLA. If you have Chicago Manual of Style that's been, sort of ingrained in you since birth, it was given to you in your mother's milk, then by all means use CMOS. The big thing, if I have a minute, I might check the website. You can check the GBEC website. The most important thing here, thank you. The most important thing, excellent, yeah. Okay, yeah, so Ellie, thank you very much. This is brilliant. And again, this was exactly my sense. The GBEC is more interested in your ability to use sources correctly than in your precise style of citation. And so again, the big thing here is just they want to make sure that you're also not taking someone else's words as your own. They want this to be your response. So open process, if you're citing someone, let them know, but by and large, they're wanting your response to it. Okay, so sorry, yeah, so you don't need a bibliography, etc. Notes don't count toward your 1,000 words. Okay, actually, yeah, brilliantly. Hope I'm just reading the very next point in my own document, which was talking about this very thing. All right, so anyway, lovely. Okay, as I said, open resource helps ease your anxiety, but don't get bogged down reading a lot, because again, it's meant to be your answer. Number 10 that I would say is proofread. Make sure that you proofread. They're actually pretty specific on the website that they want you to be able to use language correctly. So, if you have terms in whatever you've been studying, use them correctly. But they're not looking for flowery or certainly not highfalutin prose. They want you to be able to proofread and to be able to write accurately. Now, here's the other thing. Your response needs to show proficiency, and I'm sure that it will, but it needs to show proficiency, and the kind of proficiency that someone taking an MDiv or this level of study ought to show, to be able to be studying at this level ought to be able to show. That means it's not a dissertation, it's not a scholarly paper, it's not your magnum opus. Your scholarly career is not hanging in the balance. This is not a viva. And so it doesn't need to be overly technical. And actually, it's probably going to be less detailed than term papers you've written in your classes. Keep it free of unnecessary jargon. Write it in a clear style. And so I'm saying this also to say this other. Which is, you'll often hear stories, and I assure you, they're virtually all true. You will hear stories about people who have a PhD in this, that, or the other subject that they're sitting the GOEs for, and they don't sustain, they don't show proficiency. In my year, one of my colleagues had a PhD in New Testament from Princeton, no slouch. He didn't sustain scripture. I have a dear friend who is a theologian. She didn't sustain the theology. It's because people who have done a PhD who come back to do this have different ways of approaching and thinking through the issues that actually end up frustrating them in the task of showing proficiency at this level. So this is not sort of a problem with the GOEs. This is a problem of, the expectations of a PhD program have been sort of hammered into you, and you're being asked this other sort of question, which means since you've all been taking classes at this level, this should be just fine. You're just expected to show the proficiency of someone who's been taking this kind of coursework. So from the website, they say that your answers should show a balance of perception and analysis of the issues, application of resources and training, demonstration of knowledge and pastoral sensitivity, and articulation of the candidate's view. So it needs to really be a balance of all of those different things. They're not just asking your view, but if your view isn't present there, that's going to be a problem. You need to be able to analyze the issues that are present there, but you also need to be able to talk in terms of bringing some factual knowledge to bear on it. The answers for the GOE should be clear, concise, and accurate. You can introduce appropriate extrapolation, but they need to have coherent argument. There are 4 weaknesses that they caution against, and certainly I would as well. They include factual error, irrelevant information, fallacious reasoning, and unfounded opinion. None of that's a surprise to you. None of that should raise your anxiety. Well, gosh, okay, that's just a little over a half an hour. I'd like to spend a few minutes just kind of walking through a GOE question and then thinking through a response to it. But before we do that, what questions do you have?
Professor, I was wondering, could you just address how much we will expect to see issues of constitution and canons?
That's a very good question. I think it's possible. The constitutions and canons are available online and easily searchable in case you need to do some quick research. You might have a copy as well alongside. In some programs, at Betsy Seabury, for example, I know we do a class in that, but they are not a focus of one of the exams, and it would be at most a peripheral issue.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, yeah, Catherine, I see your hand.
There we go. This is in reading the rubrics, and I'm looking at the 2020 GOEs in the first set, which is on Holy Scriptures. And it talks about the exegesis of these 2 passages, one in Genesis and or one in the Old Testament, one in the New Testament, and comparing these 2. And they're asking you in the exegesis that discussion incorporates all the elements of the exegesis, including literary, historical, and theological interpretations for each passage. Would it be a big mistake to potentially first start out and say, upon reading these 2 passages against each other, these were my initial interpretations. However, in looking at various resources and what scholars are saying, this is what I'm seeing. In other words, what I've come up with on my own differs significantly from what my open resource material is saying. I mean, is that a bad way of approaching
This
an
is
answer?
moving a bit beyond what we've already covered, but I would say yes, that would not be a good way
Okay,
of approaching it.
okay,
What they would, I mean, you know, what the question is asking you to do is to, actually, I think I have that loaded up here. Bear with me while I
yeah,
look at that. Well, I did. Sorry, I was looking at that one in particular earlier tonight, and it's asking you for basically historical critical exegesis, which looks at, you know, sort of literary,
right, okay,
historical settings and so forth. And unless you're doing that yourself, to respond with, well, this is my interpretation, it is not answering the question which is asked.
right, okay. That's what I
The
thought.
question
When-
asked is, it's okay. So yeah, this is a little far afield. There might be some
Okay.
other questions.
All right,
So I would advise against that.
okay.
Um,
That could
Yeah.
potentially though be worked in as it applies to contemporary issues in the church,
yeah, possibly.
drawing that together.
I
Okay,
mean, you know, provided it's defensible and rooted in the exegesis of the text that you did
Okay.
previously.
okay, thanks.
So Lynn has asked whether there are any suggestions for one-volume Bible commentaries. I don't have any that are really brilliant. You may have run into them yourself, or even if it's not one volume, sort of a multi-volume Bible commentary or something like that you might have on your shelf from the scripture classes you've taken. And again, I'm less interested in encouraging you to buy something new than in using well what you already have. So that said, Erdman's has, for example, a one-volume Bible commentary that includes the Apocrypha even, which is, you know, a doorstopper of a book, and I can't even imagine what the, you know, the shipping would be on it, but that's one possibility. But, you know, again, I'm not necessarily recommending that over other ones. It just happens to be one that I have on my shelf. I would counsel you probably to look carefully at whatever you have on your shelf, and if, you know, you need to plug a hole or two, then do that instead of going out and getting a new resource. But, you know, but that's up to you. Yeah, but again, I would want to emphasize being familiar with what you've already done, instead of, you know, trying to gild a lily and do something else at this point. Other questions? Yeah, Barnabas.
Can you please help me understand the difference between a pastoral response question and a perspective question? Because in your guidelines, you say a pastoral response is asking for a script. So is that, can you please, either by example or something?
Right. So, for example, a pastoral response would be that, you know, the question is asking for what you would say in this situation to this person. And I mean, it might not be as formal as a script, right? So don't sort of hear movie script or something like that. But it's specifically meant to be a response that takes into account the person or group to whom you're talking and relevant contextual you know, clues that have been given to you in the question. On the other hand, though, if it's simply asking you to articulate a perspective, for example, a perspective on wealth, take a random example, then it's not asking you to be persuasive or to speak to someone. It's asking you to set out a particular perspective and what that looks like. Or alternative, I mean, and there's another question that I just ran across that's fairly recent, which is sort of in between, in that it's not a response to another person, but it's a response talking about your perspective on something to your spiritual director, and talking about your perspective that was present in a pastoral response that you gave to another person. It's almost wheels within wheels. When you read it, it's fairly clear, but that's the distinction. Then, are you communicating to someone and therefore taking specifically into account the pastoral situation, the person you're speaking to other contextual clues, or are you in a more abstract way talking about what the issue is and sort of what the facts of the matter are?
So in the question in the guidelines about the wealth and talking to the vestry,
Yep.
the portion on talking to the vestry, how would that have been different if they would have asked a pastoral response, and if they would have asked a perspective to be shared to the vestry?
Right. Okay, so yes, so in this one, yeah, you're asked to offer two Christian theological perspectives on wealth, and those are just perspectives. But then you're concluding the essay by describing how that theological perspective, one or another of those, would inform your work with the members of a vestry. You're not actually directly addressing the vestry, but you are bringing to bear those perspectives on a specific concrete situation. So it's not a matter of sort of, you're talking about how you would talk, right? So it's one level removed. They're not expecting some sort of a script or something, but instead you're saying, well, I would do this. I would, discuss how this perspective seems to me to be most persuasive and most relevant in this area, and that would then suggest that, we ought to take this initiative, or I ought to, teach the vestry in this way, and see how they would respond, that sort of thing. In other words, it's a level remove instead of a kind of responding to a particular question, a particular person. I mean,
And so if it's a question of a pastoral response, it would be more like a direct speech?
Yes, exactly. It would most likely read more like direct speech, but it doesn't have to. I mean, that's not necessarily required. You could say, well, I would say this sort of thing to the person, taking this other sort of thing into account, that kind of thing. It's just that you can't just say, well, Jerome said that wealth was dangerous, and have that be the end of it if you're meant to be responding to someone who's sort of at death's door and thinking about what to do with their wealth, right? I mean, it needs to be right. So, yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. Did I see Jill, you had a question?
Yeah, I'm interested in your perspective in terms of topics, of what the likelihood is of seeing where we're at culturally in today's world, socio-political, theological response to what's going on in the racial tensions of our world, and then also the huge dynamics of worship by distance. And I'm just wondering if you have perspective on how something like that on one or both of those topics might come out in the form of a question. Because I think we're going to get hit with that kind of stuff at some level.
So that's interesting. I will say that the general ordination exams, by virtue of being an exam that's given to all of the ordinands or people at this stage, at least in their training in the church, are very specifically, I mean, they might be topical, but they are not setting you up to have the right answer. Well, we all know that the real answer is X. They're not doing that, because we honestly have a lot of people from a lot of different perspectives who are standing for ordination, and it wouldn't be fair. What they are asking you to do is to articulate a Christian theological or biblical or historically rooted response, and make a defensible judgment about this or that issue. And so it's not at all impossible that there might be questions about these issues you raised, Jill. I mean, these are just the sorts of things that we face day to day, right, in ministry. I mean, it's not surprising. But in the same way that, frankly, there aren't obvious answers that you can just read off once you're out of seminary or past your preordination training. Likewise, the GOEs aren't going to be like that either. You need to think through the issue in conversation with the Bible, the prayer book, with the theological tradition, with the historical tradition and all of this to come up with a recognizably Christian, Anglican, and defensible sort of answer. There might be a range of possible responses. And you see, the thing is, you see this then also in the rubrics. The rubrics won't say, it must be this answer. The rubrics will say, you know, you must give a defensible response. So I hope that that's helpful. I mean, it might be. I don't know for a fact that they will. They're not usually that topical, and they do tend to try to avoid, I mean, they try to be topical, but not hot button. But the whole perspective is make a judgment, give a defensible answer that's rooted in our the resources for theology. And yes, certainly Christian ethics would come into play then, Catherine. Yeah, I mean that would certainly be, you know, one possible perspective. I mean it would depend entirely on how the question is framed. So right, and Hope had asked for a good ethics resource. If you're looking for a sort of a textbook, hang on, I'm just looking this up. I mean, again, depending on where you've studied, what classes you've taken already, you might already have great resources, and I'm not suggesting this to eclipse any of that. But I like, again, if you're just looking for a broad overview, I like the book Introducing Christian Ethics by Samuel Wells and Ben Quash. Good Lord, I just looked it up, and the hardcover is $390, so don't do that. But they do have a very reasonably priced paperback, which is less than $36. Wow. But again, but that's just one possible one. There are all sorts of resources out there too, and you quite likely already have one at hand.
Can you please mention the authors again?
Sure, it's Samuel Wells, W-E-L-L-S, and Ben Quash, which is like squash, but without the first S.
Thank you.
Yep, and it's Introducing Christian Ethics. Kind of a, you know, it's just intended to be well, it does what it says on the tin, right? It's Introducing Christian Ethics. Good. What other questions do we have at this point? Well, let's take a quick look here then at the question that I put in the document that I sent. We'll just kind of walk our way through the question, notice the parts of it, deconstruct it a little bit, and then we'll also look at the rubric. And then maybe we can even look at another rubric if you'd like, and we can use that then to strategize about our response. I mean, I've heard a number of people suggest that that's an advantageous way to think about your response, to start at the end, right? This is how I'm going to be assessed on it, so I'm going to start there and work backwards. So, okay, this is from the 2016 GOEs. You might have it right in front of you. In case you don't, I'll read it. Write an essay of about 1,000 words offering at least 2 Christian theological perspectives on wealth. Cite for each perspective at least 1 biblical or Book of Common Prayer passage and 1 Christian theologian. Of the theologians cited, 1 must be from the post-Reformation Anglican tradition. They both might be, but at least 1 must be. Conclude the essay by describing how 1 or more of your theological perspectives on wealth would inform your work with the members of a vestry faced with deciding what to do with an unexpected, substantial, and undesignated financial legacy gift. So if you read the whole question, you'll see that it's driving here toward a street-level, practical pastoral concern that's really motivating the question. The question is how to deal with a gift. It's not just asking you to set out these perspectives in the abstract. You're working toward a particular response. And so then it's important not to get hung up only doing the biblical or theological work. It's asking, also, I'll just note here, the essay is about 1,000 words. Some of the essays do say in 800 words do this, in 200 words do this. This one doesn't particularly. You know, on the face of it, you could structure this a couple of different ways, but certainly you want to do justice to every element of the question, even while it doesn't say specifically 2/3 here, 1/3 there. So, but what the question is asking you to do is to set out 2 Christian perspectives on wealth and to take one of them. I mean, you could bring both of them to bear on the last situation, but basically it's asking you to take up a defensively Christian perspective on wealth. You're not just exploring different ideas for the sake of exploration, you're building a case here for that pastoral situation at the end. You're also not just telling personal stories, you're not giving unsubstantiated opinion, you're not, it's also not asking you to articulate your own perspective on wealth. I mean, in fact, you might be articulating your perspective on wealth, and that's fine. But it's actually, the question is only asking you, in this case, to offer 2 Christian theological perspectives on wealth. That means probably also that you're not going to be quoting, you know, the Prophet Muhammad and what he said about wealth. Christian theological perspectives on wealth. That's no slight to the Prophet. That's just not what the question is asking about. But I mean, it's interesting though too, you could get into the question, and so long as you articulate 2 Christian theological perspectives on wealth, and then describe how one or more of those might inform your perspective, your work with the vestry, you don't actually even need to articulate your perspective for this question. And in fact, you could describe how a theological perspective you disagree with might inform your work with the members of the vestry, so long as it's defensible. The criterion here is defensible, not, you know, sort of authentic to you. Authentic to you is great, right? I'm just saying, be careful that, you know, be careful to read the question, because it's not actually what it's asking for. Okay, so we can then move back and look at the parts of the question, the specific elements. It's asking, as I've already mentioned, an essay of 1,000 words, at least 2 Christian theological perspectives on wealth. You could do more. Given the time, probably 2 is exactly enough, but it certainly needs to be at least 2. It cannot be less. It can't just be general notions, but Christian theological perspectives on wealth. Secondly, you need to cite for each perspective at least 1 biblical or Book of Common Prayer passage and 1 Christian theologian. So there are 2 perspectives. Each of the perspectives must have support by a theologian and Bible or BCP. Now you can have more than, you know, you need to have 1 theologian. You can use either a couple Bible references, a couple BCP references, what have you. Of the theologians cited, they stipulate that 1 has to be from the post-Reformation Anglican tradition. Now, of course, you can have a pre-Reformation theologian. You can have a post-Reformation non-Anglican theologian. You can have 2 post-Reformation Anglican theologians. Why not? But one of them must be post-Reformation Anglican, from the post-Reformation Anglican tradition. So maybe you'll find something in Hooker, maybe, if you know Hooker. Maybe you'll find something in Charles Simeon or Sarah Coakley or Rowan Williams. Some post-Reformation is 500 years, right? So you got a lot of space you can cover, a lot of people you can bring in, but they need to be a theologian, not just a bishop. They need to be a theologian, and they need to be, one of them needs to be from the post-Reformation Anglican tradition. Okay, and then obviously, as we mentioned, you conclude the essay then by describing how 1 or more, you might be able creatively to bring them both to bear on your response, right? There's no reason why not. That's not ruled out at all. But 1 or more of the theological perspectives on wealth that you've set out, How would they inform your work? And here's the thing, you're not expected to articulate two perspectives in order to argue that one of them is right and the other one's wrong. They don't need to be opposite perspectives, right? They can be adjacent or complementary. They just need to be different, not the same perspective. You're bringing them to bear on the question of a gift. You might decide actually that only one of the two perspectives that you articulate will be relevant. And it doesn't mean, it also doesn't say that you need to respond in this last section to all of the perspectives you set forth, 2 or 3 or whatever. You really only need to bring one to bear. Okay, so also the question is asking for a perspective which would inform your work with the members of a vestry. It's not asking for, you know, like a script or something. It is, as we talked about before with Barnabas's question, a kind of describing what your response would be, making clear the kinds of things you would say in this situation, how you would bring this to bear on this situation. So you'll have 2 major sections. First section is probably going to be larger. It seems it's a larger question, 2 perspectives, biblical, theological support, and the second section will discuss how those might relate to a pastoral situation. And so, you know, I would suggest that maybe you do about 600 to 700 words on the first section and another 300 to 350 words on the last section, where you're talking about how you would approach this with a vestry. Now, having said that, I'm going to share my screen here. Okay. Sorry, with Zoom, I've started narrating everything I do so that you realize I'm not just sort of staring off into space quietly, right? The things 2020 have driven us to do. It's crazy. Okay, let's see if I can do this right. See, I'm doing it again. I'm narrating. Okay, so that's the one I want to share. I'm sharing it. I'm narrating. Okay, so this is the rubric that you would have had access to in the GOEs, right? This is exactly what the exam looked like in 2016 for the question we've just been walking our way through. So you've got, you know, over here, the criteria, this is what you're being assessed on. And there are basically 2 options, right? You're proficient or you're not proficient. So, you know, we've walked through the question, we've come up with an initial response, but our next step is we're going to say, let's spend a minute looking at the rubric and see what clues that's going to give us about what they're looking for. So it's, you know, one of the things that the question is clearly asking for are theological perspectives on wealth. And it needs to be clear, you need to clearly present 2 distinct perspectives. So, you know, as you're thinking through, you need to say, okay, are these 2 perspectives that are in fact distinct? Are they, you know, Christian, are they funded by a kind of Christian theological perspective? You know, and in fact, one of the ways you'll know that your response is not proficient is that it does not present 2 distinct perspectives. Maybe you just get into the weeds on one. Maybe you think you present 2, but they end up being exactly the same one. So, you know, that would not be proficient. So, you know, you look at this and you say, okay, I need to make sure that I have 2 and they need to be distinct. Okay, that's great. So next criterion, biblical or Book of Common Prayer passages. In fact, a proficient response will include 2 different biblical or BCP passages for each perspective. The biblical or BCP references are correctly cited and are relevant to the question about wealth. You're not just sort of salting in random BCP numbers. You know, Second Hesitations had a really great thing to say about wealth, and so I'm going to include that in there. It's pretty straightforward. So, yeah.
So, but the question says 1 biblical or BCP for each perspective.
Let's see here. So at least 1 biblical or BCP passage, and for each perspective, at least 1 biblical or BCP. That's right. So this was earlier than I expected for us to learn this lesson, Barnabas, but that's a very good observation. And what this suggests then is that somehow there was an ambiguity in the way that the question was asked. Because I agree with you, actually, that's the most natural reading of the question. You need one passage, either from BCP or Bible, and one Christian theologian. Here's the value then of looking at the rubric. It's going to give you, it's going to resolve that ambiguity. Because if this hadn't been there and they had gotten all of these responses that only had one, they probably would have gone back and said, we meant to have two, but we didn't make that clear. So the GOEs are human. You know, they're as human as the people who take them and assess them. Anyway, but thank you for pointing that out. That's exactly correct. Thing is, by looking at the rubric, it's been an early intervention into our response to make clear that you need either a biblical and BCP perspective or a passage, two BCP or two biblical passages for each perspective. So I can't defend them. I can't defend them. You're exactly right. But this, like I say, this intervention has helped you to realize that they were not being clear in what they were asking. So, and in fact, over here, they're even clearer. You do indeed need 4 of the requested biblical or BCP passages. And yeah, I mean, I kind of want to find whoever wrote this question and ask them, what were you thinking? This was not clear. But again, the rubric made it clear. Okay, so
to clarify, the rubric always, or the rubric trumps the question then in clarifying.
I'm sorry, I'm not sure who I'm responding to. Oh, Allie. Okay, I'm sorry. Yeah, and what was your question, Allie? Could you repeat that, please?
The rubric then trumps the question when we're going through.
I'm sorry, there was a word that I missed. You got garbled. The rubric, what, the question?
Does it trump the question? So, I mean, I guess, is it just, do we always follow the rubric then?
Yeah, well, I mean, the rubric and the question need to match, okay? Right, I mean, so I'm not defending the GBEC at all here. This was a problem, but only because by looking at the rubric, we see what they were really asking. So what I'm saying is this should not happen. But yeah, I mean, if you run into this situation, what do? Well, you do your best to answer as they're expecting you to answer. If the most natural reading of the question is you need to give one perspective, but you're looking at the rubric and actually it says that you need 2 different biblical or BCP perspectives for each passage, and then later on they refer to 4, then you say, well, you know, that's a really dumb mistake that they made. But luckily, I can give 2 different biblical or BCP passages for each of the perspectives. That's easy, right? So you're just, you know, of the 2, they're not going to mark you down if you have more, right? If you had, say you hadn't read the rubrics up front, you know, I strongly recommend that you do, but say you didn't. But before you submit your answer, you're looking through and you're saying, oh, wait a minute, I only gave 1 biblical perspective because, you know, frankly, that's what the question said. But here they're asking for 2. Well, before you submit your answer, you go back and you say, well, okay, fine, I'll pepper a few more in there. It'll just strengthen the answer anyway. So, but there is no general strategy, though, only because this shouldn't happen. When it does, you know, go with what seems to be, you know, if in the question they had asked for 2, but in the rubric they were only saying, you know, that includes 1 biblical or BCP passage, then, you know, still, why not give 2, right? I mean, that's fine. You don't have to give 5, but, you know, you can give 2 because they're not going to mark you down if you've given 1 extra one. It's actually just going to strengthen your response. So again, That said, don't don't take this as a time to stress out and say, but if I give 10, it's going to be even better. You know, and meanwhile, you know, you're at the end of your time, right? So I hope that helps. Honestly, this shouldn't happen. This was a mistake, and they should have caught this. There's no real defense for this. But again, they're human, we're human. And in light of that, though, having read the rubric and the question, it just gives you an insight that actually it wouldn't be a big deal to add in one more reference. And in fact, no, we'll look at that, I think. Oh, no, right. Okay, there's another one. This rubric has a couple of mistakes in it, or the question, anyway. So, okay, so we've done that. We've offered the two distinct perspectives, each funded by two different biblical or BCP passages. What else? Well, the answer cites two theologians, including a post-Reformation Anglican theologian. So again, they don't say that the other one needs to be Anglican, doesn't need to be post-Reformation, doesn't need to be pre-Reformation, doesn't say anything about that at all. Just that one of them needs to be post-Reformation Anglican theologian, and that the references from theologians are relevant to the question about wealth. So, you know, if you're citing Luther as from his table talk, mentioning about how he's had a really hard stool in the morning, you know, that's just not going to be relevant, right? You need to, you know, come up with a relevant citation from a theologian. At the same time, you don't need to go out and read two different books or two different dense essays by theologians. You need to be able to you need to be able to offer some support from a theologian, a reference from a theologian. Yeah, that's a good question. So Will has asked if we have these questions during the exam, are there people from the board we can talk to, call or message? In this case, you will talk to your proctor, whoever's proctoring your exam, to ask them questions about that. Here's the thing. There shouldn't, you know, these sorts of questions shouldn't arise. So in the rare circumstance that they do, or something like you have a computer malfunction, or, you know, your house is tipped over or something like that, you know, and it's a genuine crisis. First thing you do, talk to your proctor. That person's going to be your first, yes, for those of us at Bexley Seabury, that's Ron Fox, who's a proctor. But if you're not taking it through Bexley Seabury, you'll have your own proctor, you know, the person you're working with to do the exams through. That will always be your first port in a storm. Okay, so we've presented two perspectives. They're funded by Prayer Book and Bible. We've cited two theologians, and in fact, here's the next criterion. Each pair of biblical or BCP references and theological citations combines to support the same perspective. So if you're citing a biblical reference where God seems to have a preferential option for the poor, and you cite, say, Benny Hinn, God forbid, talking about, you know, preaching the health and wealth gospel and how God blesses the ones that God truly loves with health and wealth, that's obviously going to be a completely incoherent perspective and will not support your response here. So there needs to be a coherence in your response. And so, yeah, the non-proficient here, it doesn't support the same perspective. And so that can be, you know, a mismatch between Bible and BCP or theological citation. You could have BCP and theological citation, but not Bible, what have you. So just make sure that they're all singing from the same hymn sheet, basically. Now, interestingly, this is just going to take a bit of critical reading here. Okay, so we've read this for what is a non-proficient response incoherence. So now we're going to say, okay, Now, here's this last section that we're looking at, the approach to the vestry, where you're talking about how this is going to fund your approach to the vestry. Well, what's a proficient response? Each pair of biblical or BCP references and theological, what? This sounds really familiar. Holy cats, all they did is cut and paste what was the non-proficient up here. That's not right. Now, again, this is a rather embarrassing mistake that they've committed. Again, I'm not defending them. This sucks. They needed to proofread this. But you can easily, on the basis of the non-proficient response, recreate what a proficient response will be. Okay? This isn't an occasion to freak out. You wouldn't have to go to your proctor about this, you know, what have you. So what you do is you say, okay, well, you really kind of, you know, did a bad job there, GBEC, but you did give us a non-proficient, and let's read what that says. The answer does not include at least one reasoned approach to working with the vestry on the question about wealth. Well, what would be the proficient response there? Clearly, the answer does include at least one reasoned approach to working with the vestry on the question of wealth. That's not rocket science. So what else is the non-proficient response going to have? The answer does not make a connection between one of the theological perspectives and the practical theological approach to working the vestry. For example, it shows a third perspective on wealth different from the two outlined previously. Well, if that's non-proficient, then clearly a proficient one is going to say, well, you've set out these two perspectives, and you've taken one of them, at least, and actually connected it then with a practical perspective that you have articulated to the vestry, instead of saying, hey, look, these are the kind of things that Christian theologians say, but actually I've got this great idea over here, which is totally different than what those guys said. So this is just a matter of trying to have a well-integrated essay. And I think that the proficient response can easily be reconstructed from the non-proficient response. Again, I apologize. That's simply a silly mistake that they've made, and they should know better than that. They work really hard on these things. I'm not sure how that slipped through, but there you go. I'll stop sharing. Hope has a question about other suggested resources or websites to have on hand. No, not really. I mean, you might have the National Church website's quite a thicket, right? I mean, you kind of want to maybe have that called up, or, you know, just glance through it to see what's there. But, I mean, you know, it could be better. So, yeah. Well, we have the same individual reader for each of the 6 questions. Oh, right. So, okay. So David is asking the question, if I'm understanding that correctly. Sorry, I'll just get to that in a moment. So Hope, I'm not sure that there would be any particular websites that are going to be really key for you. It will all depend on what question you're looking at. And Google's good enough. It'll pull up something quickly for you. But again, your major strategy is just going to be having the resources. And I keep doing this, like there's a stack of books here. For some of you, actually, it might be PDFs that you have sort of loaded up in the background that you've been using. Maybe you were using an e-reader or something like that, right? So you won't have a stack of books, but you'll have your e-reader with you, or PDFs in the background, or whatever that you can search and look through. So yeah, so have those at hand. Now, David has asked the question, will we have the same individual readers for each of the 6 questions, or will they likely rotate reading different questions, or do we know? Well, I'll tell you, the way that the Board of Examining Chaplains works, you've got 2 readers who read through the entire exam. So you've got 2 perspectives, and in the event that you have a non-proficient response, you'll have a 3rd reader, and in the event that you have multiple non-proficient responses, you'll have another reader on top of that, you know, to ask questions about, you know, is this an issue with language, or perhaps there are learning differences involved? You know, should this person have had some sort of provisions made, you know, allowances of some kind? you know, there are any number of issues that might lie behind a non-proficient response. It's not just that, you know, any number of things. And so, yeah, so they take that seriously. But yeah, there is a coherent, you know, constancy of readers across them, and that shouldn't matter. I mean, you know, proficient response to proficient response, and it's all blinded, so they have no clue who you are, which seminary you're from, whether you went to seminary or not. Maybe you read for orders. They don't know. It's just, believe me. So when I did this, I just got a stack of papers, and there was like a number on it, and that's it. You're assigned a number in taking the GOEs, and that's all we see. Catherine, it looks as if you have a question.
Less a question, and then you just triggered a couple of things for me from that Beth Eli YouTube, where she was saying if English is not your first language, to type that on the top of each of your essays. English is not my first language, or my, you know, and then what was, oh God, the other thing, and it just slipped out of my brain. It was, I can't remember what it is. If I can remember, if it circles back around, but it was something else from Beth Eli as well. I can't remember.
Yeah. Oh, Will, yes.
I had a question about context. So I think when I've encountered, especially pastoral response questions before, the challenge has been because I have no relationship and no context with the supposed person. When
Right.
if I did, I would, you know, I ask a question like, well, I don't know, tell me how that worked for you, or something like that. Do you just have any tips about not getting tripped up in that? I feel like I've gotten tripped up in that before by kind of making up context for the imagined scenario, and that's not really maybe been the best solution.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, making up a lot of relevant context isn't going to be helpful, because that would influence your response, and they're actually just asking you to respond to what's there. I think that, okay, so, yeah, they're really just asking you to respond to what they've given you in that, and I wouldn't expand that too much. Sorry, I'm just looking at, again, narrating myself, looking at another GOE question, which is asking for a pastoral response. Okay, pastoral letter, okay. Okay. Okay, so here, why don't I share this? Okay, so you're a recently ordained priest in a rural diocese. Your bishop appointed your priest in charge of a pastoral-sized parish with an average Sunday attendance of 80. You know, welcome to Idaho. The parish is in a small town with a population of 500 and a county with 15,000 people. See Idaho. Veteran priest who serves a 45-minute drive away is your mentor. Your bishop is headquartered a 5-hour drive from you. Let's call it Boise. Soon after you arrive, a newly retired same-sex couple who are Episcopalian and have recently moved into town approach you with a request that you preside at their wedding. No such liturgy has previously been performed at your parish. The couple quotes a 2015 U.S. Supreme Court decision as inspiration for their request. Your bishop has issued a pastoral letter indicating that General Convention has authorized such rights in the Episcopal Church, though, in accord with our canons, a priest can decline to solemnize any marriage. Construct a pastoral response to this situation in a 1,000-word essay. Explain how the practice of ministry interplays with the theology of marriage in the Episcopal Church. Refer to the appropriate canons of the Episcopal Church. So here's a situation where you would need to refer to the canons, but it's not essentially a canon law question, if you see what I mean, for that earlier question about the cons and cans. So refer to the appropriate canons of the Episcopal Church and or resolutions from Gen Con that will guide your pastoral response. Identify the key parties involved, tell how you would engage those various parties in this situation, include what considerations you might give to those who hold different views. And so I think this is probably a good example, Will, of the kind of pastoral question you'll be asked to give. It's not usually, as I was indicating earlier, a kind of script. It's more a matter of this is my approach. These are the things that I would say. This is what would inform my decision. Here's how I would interact with those people who might disagree with me, just as it's set out here. So it's a little less, I mean, because, yeah, I mean, obviously, right, someone asks you a random coffee hour question, your first response is, tell me a little bit more about that, or it's interesting that you ask that, right? I mean, those are great responses because you want more information, especially if you don't already know this person. And, you know, by dint of being fictional, you don't know any of these people, right? They're just hypothetical. But work with what's given you. And in most of the cases, you're not needing a personal pastoral response. It's more describing, here's how I would approach it. Here's what would inform that. And then, of course, you know, the rubric will be your friend here as well, giving the sort of things that the question is looking for. I hope that's helpful, and that seemed a good question overall. I'm sorry, I was cutting someone off.
Sure. No, to piggyback on Will's question, and I think your answer here was really helpful. Are the readers looking for, like, at least a little exposition saying, like, based on the knowledge, like literally language that says, based on the knowledge provided by this question, I would blank. So not fabricating a scenario or not kind of inventing context, but to say, like, I would imagine the opportunity to ask more questions that might sound like blah, blah, blah. Does that sort of exposition help in answering some of these pastoral questions that don't have a lot of context?
Could you repeat your penultimate sentence, Hope? I was with you up until that point, and I think I missed something there about asking questions. Could you say that again, please?
No problem. So for example, in like constitutions and canons class, we had these kind of short answers that had very little context. And I think I leaned toward, and a number of classmates did, and it seemed to make sense to say, with the information given,
yeah,
I would blank, however, comma, with additional information, I might blank. So it's almost just like it's a linguistic catch-all kind of exposition to say, essentially saying, I don't have enough information, but based on what I do know, this.
Right. So yeah, that's exactly what they're asking. That's exactly what they're asking. Now, you might say, as a kind of nice rhetorical flourish at the end, you know, if there were relevant information which is not included in this question, I might have a slightly different response. But that is not fundamentally what they're asking, okay? And again, the principle here is always first answer the question that they're asking. And in this case, the question they're asking is, what would be your pastoral response in this situation? It doesn't front load exactly what it's going to be. You know, you've got discretion, you can construct it in a couple different ways, but based on the information that you have, what would your response be? Recognizing, of course, if you were in, I don't know, I'm fixed on Idaho, but Idaho, and, you know, knowing the people, knowing the situation, knowing the surrounding context, knowing all manner of information, background information that you simply don't have here, you might actually have a totally different response. But based on what's given here, this is what your response would be. So, and yeah.
Gotcha. And so that rhetorical flourish, I like the way you put that, is like, I almost feel like as an indicator to a reader that says, I know there might be more here. And so that's kind of a positive thing to kind of tack on.
Yeah.
Or it's irrelevant.
It can be, but, you know, make sure it's the very last thing you put on. Because what the reader will actually be looking for is just making sure that, you know, given this, given that, given this other thing that is provided there, here's what your response would be. So, you know, and you're giving a reasoned and defensible response. Or actually, I mean, what are they asking for here? You know, pastoral response, talk about, you know, practice of ministry and theology of marriage, refer to the cons and cans and Gen Con resolutions as appropriate. That's going to guide your response. Who are the key parties involved? You know, how important is that mentor that they gave you 45 minutes away? You know, is that actually one of the key parties? tell how you're going to engage all those various parties in that situation. So if you do that, boom, you're done. And then at the end, you can say, but in fact, I recognize as much as you do, dear reader, that this is a bit of a hypothetical and abstract situation. In fact, there might be other background contextual information that would cause me to answer differently, right? But I mean, again, that's just a little rhetorical flourish at the end. That's actually not how if you didn't include that, you would still get a proficient response, if you see what I mean. I mean, in the actual practice of ministry, that's really relevant. In the GOEs, yeah. Catherine, you have another question, looks like.
Yeah, it wasn't a question. I found that other bit of information. Beth Eli made the point of when answering, do not give away identifying information,
Right.
like no professor's names. So if you're
Yeah.
going to do a citation with, say, lecture notes, you wouldn't be saying, in Professor Fout's class, or in my lecture notes from Professor Fout's class, not your bishop name, not your seminary name, not your field placement site, absolutely nothing that would identify you in any way or anyone you have connection to.
Correct.
So that was the other thing. I thought, oh, I could have slipped up on that one.
Yep. Nope. It has to be totally blinded because they're not, none of those things are relevant to the response. Yeah, Barnabas.
So just going back to one of your earliest comments, and I think also it's somewhere in the document, how are responses to perspective questions or reasoned thinking questions, how do they have to be different from simply academic papers? And the reason why I'm asking is I've been in that line of writing for some time, and so when does it become problematic? If it's answering the question, is it still okay to be technical, or is it better to avoid technical jargon, or how to navigate that?
I would, sorry, what background do you have, Barnabas? Do you have a previous theology degree or biblical studies or something like that? Or
I'm a PhD candidate in theology at the Divinity School. Yeah.
Oh, right. Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That's excellent. But so the way that I would put it then, Barnabas, would be, especially in a theology response, do not be technical. Do not use technical jargon. Think of it as if you were speaking to a well-educated layperson, and by well-educated, I mean, a bachelor's degree, not a PhD. But, a literate, engaged layperson. So you're speaking and to a layperson who doesn't have a deep background in it, okay? And then, you might, substantiate your answer with a biblical reference, a BCP reference, or, Moltmann or whoever, right? Some theologian in parentheses, but it's not going to use technical jargon. It's going to be expressed in a way that you would expect to express theology in a vestry meeting or in a sermon or talking with someone over coffee who isn't also in the guild. So I hope that helps. Because yeah, believe me, I mean, I've been there, right? It's easy to sort of get into it, right? And you get kind of excited about this, and there are actually some real fine distinctions you want to make and that sort of thing. But no, that's not what the GOE is asking for. Okay, it's asking for something more like, this is the kind of thing I would say over coffee. This is if I were making some notes to myself about what I'd say to a vestry. It's a very different level of communication and working than you would be doing in a dissertation or an academic essay or a peer-reviewed journal article. Those are valuable and useful. They're not what we're doing with GOEs.
So basically, a conversation that can be understood in church, right?
Exactly. So what if the head of the altar guild came to you and asked you this question, right? How how would you be able to express it in a way that he or she might be able to get it and say, oh, okay, right, I get that, instead of, well, I mean, have you read Gutierrez? Do that, and then get back and we'll talk, right? So I hope that helps. Other questions? So two things I'll leave you with then. I mean, if there are other questions before we sign off, that's great, but I'll just leave you with, manage your anxiety, read the question, respond to the question, and do so by engaging with the rubric. Those are really going to be your most important tasks between now and the 8th of January. And on the 8th of January, you'll be done. It'll be fine. This too shall pass, and you too shall pass. So we're an hour and a half in. I don't mean to keep you much longer unless you have other questions. And I just wanted to give sort of another minute or two for that to percolate if there are any. Well, seeing none, I think you all have my email address because I emailed you. So if you have follow-up questions, please do. Please, don't be bashful. Email me. I'll be happy to respond. I mean, not during the exam, right? I've got other things going on. But before then, as you're preparing and thinking about it and that sort of thing, absolutely. I'm so pleased that you've been able to pop in from New Mexico, Jill. This is what this is all about, right? It's not. It's about trying to connect with as many people as we can and be a blessing to as many as we can. So, seeing no other questions, again, like I said, feel free to email me, but I think we'll call it a night for now. Okay? Well, good
Thank you,
night.
Dr.
So long.
Fowler.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Blessings.
Thank you.
Thank you.